I'm happy to be joined today by Father Ron Rolheiser to discuss his insights on suicide. It's a very difficult and often misunderstood topic, but it's a topic that unfortunately touches many people's lives in one way or another. So, Father Rolheiser, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Shari.
Well, here's where I'd like to start, because every time I hear of a suicide, the reaction I inevitably hear, and usually from multiple people, is something like, and I heard this following Robin Williams' death as well, something like, how could they do this to their family? Or how could they be so selfish? And what is your response to people who have that sort of reaction to suicide?
Okay, and excellent question. Shari, let me begin. I want to put a few numbers to this first, too. I don't think so many people realize how prevalent suicide is in the United States. So just let me give you a few numbers. You know that in the United States, more than 33,000 people die of suicide every year, which means about 91 people per day. And that breaks down to 3 or 4 every hour. So during the course of this interview, about 2 people in the United States will commit suicide. Now, I want to use that as a basis for your question. People say, how can they do that to their families and so on? Well, the first thing I want to say about suicide is, and again, I have to qualify this, in most cases, not all cases, there can be suicides where it is just really some act of selfishness or whatever. But in most cases, and certainly that's true of probably the 5 or 6 people that I've known who have committed suicide, they die against their will. The same as, people who die of cancer, people who die of stroke, people who die of heart disease, nobody can say, well, how can they be so selfish and do this to their families, Well, the person would say, I'm dying against my will. Now, a suicide person can't say that, but in fact they are. One of my analogies is, imagine somebody whose clothing is on fire, and so they jump out of a high-rise window to somehow try to save themselves. Of course, they're killing themselves. In many cases, suicide, and I'm sure many of your listeners know people have been touched by it, and people in their own family were invariably very sensitive people, wounded people, and their suicide is what I call the emotional equivalent to a cancer, stroke, or heart attack. Death by suicide, most times that's an emotional cancer. And sometimes cancer can be treated and sometimes it can't, or it's an emotional heart attack. And that's why it can also happen just out of the blue. Sometimes people commit suicide and there's been a long buildup. Other times it's just a bolt of lightning from the blue. Well, it's the same with heart attacks.
So the idea, there's a lot of debate around the idea is it a choice or not? Did they choose this? And some people argue, well, of course they chose it, because you have to do some act to create it. But is there, and maybe I'm talking semantics here, but in my mind, sometimes I feel like it's not their choice in that they don't want to die, but it was their decision. They did make a decision maybe they really did not want to make, but for whatever reason felt they didn't have another choice.
That's a very good question, Shari, but it's predicated on a question of freedom. See, freedom, I think in our common sense things, we think of freedom as it's all or nothing. I was free or I wasn't. But in fact, freedom is a massive gradation. There's a grades. So we do things more or less freely. Anybody look back on your life and decisions you made at 19, 20, 25, you say, were you really free? Well, you're influenced by so many factors. So that, radically, if I can use the philosophical word, existentially, it's a free decision. They choose to kill themselves. But most times it's, to use that analogy, the person who jumps out of a high building because their clothing is on fire, they freely chose to jump out of the building. But why? Because they were on fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know you get the metaphor there. See, so freedom isn't all or nothing. Freedom is more or less. But I would still submit that most suicide victims, they leave the world against their will. The same as if you die of cancer or a heart attack or a car accident.
Yeah. And I've heard you differentiate also between somebody being a victim of suicide versus somebody who kills themselves.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So, for instance, speaking personally, I have known 4 or 5 people whom I knew pretty deeply who committed suicide. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the people I knew, in every case, it was somebody who was so sensitive and so bruised that they could no longer be touched in this life. Okay. Now that's very different than Adolf Hitler killing himself. See that, so that their suicide can be. Let me put it in a simple distinction. For most suicide, it's an act of weakness. In somebody like Hitler, it's somebody who says, "I'm simply too proud to live as a human being. I want to kill myself." Notice that's a very different thing than somebody who's just too bruised to continue living.
Yeah. We're talking about the person themselves, but there's obviously, when someone does this, there is a lot of people left behind who feel a lot of pain, a lot of guilt, sometimes a lot of anger, maybe felt like they've been abandoned. What is your advice to these people? Because I'm sure you have counseled many people, in that situation.
Well, first of all, you've named the feelings well. There's going to be anger. There's going to be abandonment. There's going to also be a sense of shame. There's going to be a lot of second guessing, invariably. What should I have done? Should I have been alert? Where did I let this person down? I should have been there. And see, those are going to be, first of all, those are natural feelings, and give yourself permission to feel that. When I work with, and I started writing columns on suicide about 15 years ago, and now not a single week goes by where I'm not talking to somebody or emailing somebody about losing a loved one in a family. And oftentimes, I tell them, no, be angry. Give yourself permission to be angry. You can't deny your feelings. There's going to be a feeling of anger, of abandonment, some sense of shame. Give yourself over to those feelings, but then also, as time goes on, try to understand that, so that, and sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it takes 5 to 7 years before people can kind of let it go and begin to see that person again in their goodness. Mm-hmm. So those feelings are natural, and let me talk about 2 of them specifically. One of them is the question of shame. Mm-hmm. As much as our society claims we're free, that's still a deep societal thing. So notice, no obituary says suicide. They say they died suddenly, unexpectedly, whatever. Nobody could put the word out there because there's still a stigma. There's still a powerful stigma around suicide. And we feel that, and we can't just say, well, I don't feel it. We do, mm-hmm. And then what happens oftentimes is and this is sad, we begin to erase that person's memory. So that not only they died, but, the photographs come down. We never talk about how they died. It's kind of like they become a non-person.
Right.
And again, that's a natural grieving process. But at a certain point, our task with our loved ones is to redeem their memory. I want to recommend a very excellent book by, she's a psychiatrist at Harvard, Nancy Rappaport, mm-hmm. and her mother committed suicide when Nancy was a little girl. And just recently, she's written a wonderful book called In Her Wake, In My Mother's Wake, and which is her, as an adult psychiatrist with her own family, going back and redeeming her mother's memory, why this happened to her mother, and kind of honoring her mother, putting the photographs back up and mm-hmm. saying, if my mom had died of cancer, I'd still be proud of her as my mother, mm-hmm. So we need to do that. That's the shame part. The second part is our second guessing. We're always guessing, like, if only I'd been there, I should have taken a phone call, I should have reached out, why wasn't I more alert? And there I tell people, no, don't second guess. Because, suicide, it's planned exactly so that you aren't there.
Right.
Had you shown up, they'd have done it a day later or a day earlier. It's a disease, and you can't second guess it, So I always tell people, don't feel a shred of guilt, that this is not about you.
Right. And as people listening to this right now, if there's people who are in that position, I'm sure these words are really comforting. But to those who are not, who haven't been, aren't one of those ones in the close circle of family or friends left behind, I think it's really important that when most of us do know people who are grieving that or who have grieved, and that feeling of shame that you talk about, I think it's so important for all of us to make a point of talking about that person. You don't have to talk about how they died, but keep that person's memory alive for those loved ones so that those loved ones know it is okay to talk. You're okay with it. Because I think sometimes they may want to talk about their loved one that did this, but they don't know if they really can. So if you on the outside of that circle come in and continually bring that person's name up, talk about their life, different memories, whatever, I think it helps a lot.
And be able to say, like again, we don't have to say, my mom died of suicide or something. Say, my mom was an extraordinarily sensitive person, and she struggled emotionally precisely because she was so sensitive. And things like this, and then it makes us see their life as their life and not just their manner of death. See, what suicide tends to do is it tends to take their manner of death and then obliterate the goodness of their life.
Right.
This person. That's why I say we erase the memory. Literally, we take the photographs off the wall, and see. And we may have to do that for a while, but like Nancy Rappaport, maybe as an adult or years later, we got to come back and say, I'm going to redeem my mother's memory. She was a wonderful woman. She was a sensitive woman, and because of that, she died in this particular way.
Right. And from a faith perspective, how do you counsel around the whole idea of suicide?
Well, there's two things at play here in the faith perspective. See, suicide, and I hope I'm not getting in trouble for saying this, but this is my own feeling. It's strong. And I'm a Catholic priest with a deep faith. But I believe suicide is psychological illness. And the same with, if you have cancer or heart disease or Parkinson's, faith normally can't cure you. That's physical. But it's the same with suicide, that the anatomy of somebody moving towards suicide is deeply psychological and emotional. And oftentimes faith won't play much of a role there. So it's not so much that people with strong faith don't commit suicide, people with weaker faith, it's a sickness, faith plays in is our understanding of this, and what happens to our loved ones after they die, God's mercy, God's compassion, and so on. So faith puts the question of somebody's death by suicide in a much, much bigger and ultimately consoling perspective. So and even I don't know if studies have ever been done, but certainly the people that I knew who died of suicide, it wasn't that they didn't have faith. They were just so psychologically wounded and bruised that at a certain point nobody could touch them anymore. And vice versa. I know people with no faith at all who have a robust mental health. See, your mental health is like your physical health. It can be robust or it can be very, very fragile. And some people are gifted with a robust physical health. They can just absorb anything. And other people are really fragile. Well, it's the same psychologically. Some people just have a robust mental health, and other people are fragile as glass, and they've been wounded, or sometimes it's even, maybe perhaps a lot of times, even biochemical.
Right. Along those lines, though, it's still so important that someone contemplating this doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, I'm destined for this, I have no choice, because that's...
No, that's the same as if you have breast cancer in your family. You can't say, well, I'm destined for it, and so on. You say, I have to take precautions that, it doesn't, I got to make sure I'm not doing things that might bring it on. I got to get regular checkups, so on.
Right. But as a Roman Catholic priest, you would say to someone who has lost somebody to suicide, because there was a time when the church thought, well, this was a sin, right? If you do this, and people were worried about the eternal life of somebody who committed suicide, and you would say that's not to be concerned about, correct?
in a good number of cases. Again,
Right.
making that distinction made earlier between the bruised, sensitive person who dies and Hitler.
Right.
And even Hitler, we can't judge his eternal state. But see, in terms of, let me go back on the Catholic thing, and not just Catholic thing. This is pretty general in the population. See, suicide is the ultimate taboo. It breaks the ultimate taboo, and so therefore it really does rock something inside of us. And then, in a simplistic, catechetical way, it wasn't ever the official teaching of the church. People kind of understood that suicide was the ultimate act of despair. That's what it's called, This person despaired and killed themselves, and therefore they can't go to heaven. And it used to be until a couple, really into the 60s, they wouldn't bury people who committed suicide inside of church grounds. They had to be buried outside, and so on, with the idea that this person can't be in heaven. Today, the understanding is very, very different, and if we on this side understand with compassion, I look at the people I know have died of suicide. They're some of the most sensitive, gentle people I've ever known. Okay, well, if God doesn't let them into heaven, what kind of God are we dealing with?
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to go into heaven, but with that kind of God? But also, when you look at the God that Jesus reveals and incarnates in Scripture, that's a God who can literally descend into hell and does. So, as I say in these articles, I am certain, I've used the word certain, that the people I've known who have committed suicide, when they woke up on the other side, God was standing inside of their private hell and saying, "Peace be with you." That the way you see in John chapter 20, where the resurrected Jesus comes through locked doors. Notice that the disciples are huddled in fear. They got the door locked. Jesus comes through the locked doors and stands in the middle. People who die of suicide, most of them, they get into a private hell, into some kind of private shell that no medicine, no human love, nothing can penetrate, and they die that way. But God can penetrate that, and God does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess, obviously, no matter what, we can't lose sight of the fact that God's put each of us on this earth for a reason, and it's never His desire for any of us to prematurely leave this life early. And we have to stay focused on that, whether we're the person contemplating it or we're someone trying to counsel somebody out of it, which is a very, very important thing to do if you know somebody who's depressed. But I guess what you're also trying to do is offer comfort to the people that when you've really tried everything you can, some of your words today have definitely offered some hope to the people who are left behind and just really struggling with all those emotions.
Sure, if I can say some last thing on that, but this is a very good point you brought up, and sometimes I'm anxious about that. I don't work in a suicide prevention center. My work is almost entirely with people who have lost loved ones to suicide. Okay, That's a different literature. See, so that I do sometimes worry if you say, well, I don't worry about the eternal salvation, it's a sickness. People say, are you giving people permission? Are you making it easier for them to commit suicide? That's an anxiety. And I wouldn't be doing this talk to somebody who phones me in a suicide prevention center. See, there you're trying to give them things to hang on to and so on. I'm working with the survivors, the families and so on, and that's a different literature. So I do worry about that question, and I take consolation in this, that our instinct for life is so strong. It's so strong that I don't think that by telling somebody, if you kill yourself, you're not going to go to hell, that's going to make the difference. But yours is a very valid question, very valid concern. If you're working in a suicide prevention thing, you need a different literature. If you're preaching at suicide funerals the way I am, working with mothers and families who are torn to pieces and are themselves in near despair, then you need this kind of literature.
Right. No, that's a really, really important point. And, many of us listening may find ourselves on both ends, where if you're aware of somebody who's very depressed, you need to seek help for that person. There's no question about it, professional help, and you can't let that slip. And then if you're on the other end where you are, often, counseling and just kind of holding these grieving families, there's some really, important information and thoughts and care that needs to be given there. And I think, you've really helped to give some of those words and thoughts that we can all share with those that we know who suffer once this kind of event has happened. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope that these thoughts can be of some consolation to a lot of wounded people who are dealing with some pretty deep darkness from this sickness.